It's the May bank holiday weekend. Matthew Gould has discovered his 17-year-old daughter Ellie collapsed on the kitchen floor in a pool of blood. He immediately calls 999.
There was a large amount of blood. There was still a knife in her neck. Ellie was found face down, and a hand was on the handle of the knife, which was in the left side of her neck. We have to consider all options, is this a suicide, or is this an accident, or is it indeed a homicide?
When you've got a single person who's injured or dead, your concerns are, is there anyone else within that property that is also injured? So you need to double check that house. Everything was looking like it was in place. Windows didn't appear to be smashed, the back door was locked, the front door was locked. There was nothing that indicated that anyone had forced entry into the property. And then at that point, it's stop everything, lock it down, secure it, so that we can then start thinking about our forensic recovery from that area.
Ellie's mum, Carol, rushes home.
There were police cars everywhere, an ambulance on the drive, and Matt crying at the end of the drive. And I can remember running up to him and saying, what's happened? And he just said, she's dead. Just disbelief, really. How has she died? Climbed up on something, fallen, hit her head. And then I just remember Matt saying, Carol, there was just too much blood. There was too much blood. And that's the only thing he could say because he was so shocked by everything.
Carol calls her sister, Nicola.
She said, Nick, something awful's happened. And I said, well, what? And she said, there's been an accident. I said, oh my goodness, is Ellie okay? What's happened? And then she said, Nick, she's died. We were just in absolute shock.
There's no way to describe the feeling. It's like life drains out of you.
I felt very numb at the time, just being in utter disbelief. Ellie was the first person that I've ever really lost in my life. Dealing with grief in itself is something I'd never encountered before. Kind of everything just kind of went blank, really.
Sarah Thurkle has investigated more than 500 deaths and is one of the UK's leading forensic trainers.
Entering a crime scene, I would immediately consider several different hypotheses as to how somebody's died. Is it a suicide? Is it a murder? Or is it some other unexplained reason as to why somebody's being found dead?
There's absolutely no way could it be possible suicide. She had a happy home life. There's absolutely no way that was a reason for her death. I assumed there'd been an accident in the home. I couldn't understand what she was doing at home because in my mind she should have been at school. I don't know, I thought maybe she'd got home early, maybe her friend had dropped her home early. I don't know what I thought. I just thought she'd had some sort of accident.
We called the services of a forensic pathologist. A forensic pathologist will look at the scene and interpret the way the body has been left, look at the circumstances surrounding the body. The pathologist said that this was not an accident. Ellie had suffered catastrophic injuries to her neck. They counted 13 wounds. Potentially could have been more because the knife was still within her neck at the time. We were able to ascertain that the knife used was from a block in the family home, and yes, there are clear signs of a struggle. What the examination was also able to ascertain was that she had been strangled prior to being stabbed, and most likely was that she was incapacitated at the point she was stabbed.
There were abrasions on the elbows, on the hands, which would indicate that that person was trying to defend themselves. It's a frenzied attack, there's no other way of looking at that.
Immediately afterwards, the offender placed the knife in Ellie's hand and reinserted it into her wound to make it look like a suicide. This indicates a distinct callousness. It's demonstrated by not fleeing the scene in a panicked way, but rather thinking of ways that make sure that they are not implicated in this offence.
We were in the custody suite in Wiltshire, and the family liaison officers who were looking after us at the time were very good at keeping us updated. I remember him coming in and saying, we've got an update for you. we're investigating a murder. And just those words, a murder. I just remember feeling absolutely shell-shocked and couldn't even speak. Who would come into our house and murder Ellie? She had no enemies.
It did not cross my mind once that she'd been murdered, just being in utter disbelief.
As the details unfolded, the worst of it was when we were told she'd had to fight for her life and she knew what was happening. I can honestly say that was when something broke inside me. That takes you to a whole level of emotion.
Your mind goes into overdrive and you think there was somebody dangerous on the loose and she opened the door to them and they attacked her in the home, or maybe a burglary that went wrong.
In terms of whether or not we considered this was a burglary, at the early stages we just didn't know enough, in all honesty. There wasn't any other signs to suggest that that would have been a motive.
With a knife still in situ within a wound on a deceased victim, it's really important that this is firstly recorded photographically, but also it would be really important to preserve any forensic evidence on this knife before pathology is able to remove it. The knife is going to be heavily bloodstained from the victim's blood, but quite often when someone's stabbed in a frenzied attack, the offender might also have injuries on their hands if the knife has slipped. There may well be offender's DNA or fingerprints on the handle of that knife and also on the blade. There is probably going to be trace evidence of the offender on her body. If she's put up a fight or if she scratched the offender or hit the offender, there may well be trace evidence under her fingernails or on her hands that may lead to a potential offender.
Once all of the evidence is preserved, Ellie's body is taken to the mortuary, and the CSIs continue their forensic harvest, where they discover signs the offender has tried to cover their tracks.
We had scientists come in and they've said that clearly they can see from that blood smearing that someone has tried to clean up that scene at some point.
We identified that there were items missing from the kitchen as well, including tea towels, which we suspect have been used to clean up.
So now have we got another scene somewhere where items have been removed from the house and maybe dumped somewhere?
CSIs looking at the clean-up operation would also be searching any bins within the house, but also bins outside to see if there's any discarded items. With the vast amount of blood that was in the kitchen on the floor, it would be probably impossible for the offender not to have blood, not only on their clothing but also on their shoes. There may be an attempt to remove some of this blood while still at the scene.
In a knife-frenzied attack, someone may well cut themselves. So there is a chance that they might try to wash off the blood from their victim, but they also might be trying to wash off blood from themselves so they're not spreading that around the house.
The CSIs inspect the sink, which appears to have been recently used.
These particular areas will be tested using the Castle-Mayer test. It's a really good presumptive test for blood. It can test dilute blood up to 1 in 10 dilution to confirm that there's blood there, and then this would be swabbed.
The swab samples from the knife and the sink are fast-tracked to the lab. A DNA profile would provide the investigation with a much-needed lead.
You never know what bit of evidence is a crucial piece of evidence that will catch the killer.
Police in Wiltshire are investigating the suspicious death of 17-year-old sixth form student Ellie Gould. Her body was discovered on the kitchen floor, and there are signs her attacker has attempted to clean up the crime scene and make it look like a suicide by placing the knife in Ellie's hand and the blade into her neck.
Ellie was such a friendly, caring, gentle young lady and was blossoming into a beautiful young lady.
Just a lovely girl. She lit up a room when she walked in.
She'd be always the first one to crack a funny, have a laugh. She was a lovely young lady, full of life.
She had a huge love for animals. We bought her her first pony when she was about 10. And she adored her.
Good girl.
Used to spend hours grooming her and taking her to the local shows in Wiltshire.
Ellie pretty much got Jess into horse riding.
You just saw the huge amount of joy they used to get out, and both Jess and Ellie had a massive love for it.
I just have lots of fond memories of her setting up jumps that were way out of my comfort zone, just kind of not telling me, just edging them up. Just daft things like that I look back really fondly of.
Carol would always be out with Ellie when Ellie was riding, walking along in sleet, snow, rain, whatever. Carol was always there. It was a remarkably close relationship.
As Ellie got older, I suppose it becomes even more of a friendship. They would love shopping, going out, seeing people, friends.
We were extremely close. She used to talk to me a lot about what was going on at school and friendships. She was delightful. She was studying psychology A-level and she was particularly interested in that. She had an idea that she would like to join the mounted police because of her ability in riding. Would have gone far in life.
Detectives speak with Ellie's mother, Carol, to establish Ellie's movements that day.
We had a general chit-chat about the day. She was eating a cereal as normal. I was about to go to work. She said she was revising from home in the morning because if she went into school, she knew she'd be distracted by friends in the common room. And she'd made arrangements for her friend Ellie to come and pick her up and drive her into school.
When we looked at the telephony and Ellie's phone, we were able to say that there was a text sent, I think around about 11:54, 11:55, which effectively told Ellie's friend not to come and pick her up. She was due to go into school that afternoon for studying, and it was all arranged, but a single text was sent to say, look, we're going to stay at home now. We looked at that and we found that really odd. There was no reason why she would cancel it.
Police need to identify why Ellie cancelled her friend, and if it was not her, then was it her killer that sent this message? At the family home, the CSIs continue their forensic harvest.
Because there was no forced entry into the property, CSIs would have to explore every opportunity and every potential source of forensic evidence. This would start at the outside of the house and work in. Are there footprints on the drive? Are there footprints around the back of the house? Are there peering in marks in the windows? If Ellie's been watched, maybe there's like marks where someone's been looking in. DNA swabs would be taken from outside of the front door handle, the back door handle, the letterbox, if someone's been peering in. Any other potential surfaces that may well have been touched by the offender if they followed Ellie into the house, or indeed if Ellie had let them into the house. And it's our job to find that forensic evidence to link them back to the scene.
At the forensic lab, the scientists have raised a DNA profile from the swabs taken from both the knife and the sink. But they only match to Ellie and no one else, further confirming her killer has gone to great lengths to cover their tracks.
We then revert back to what we most know about crimes of that nature, based on our professional knowledge, our experience, and of course the statistics. The majority of females who are killed by a person known to them. And certainly in a domestic setting, the majority of those individuals are as a result of a partner or ex-partner or a family member.
Whilst the detectives hunt for the murderer, they need to eliminate those that knew Ellie from the investigation and learn that Ellie had a boyfriend from school called Thomas.
One day after school, she told me that a boy had asked her out and she was quite excited. He was the first boy that had ever asked her out. He lived in a village near to here. Some of his friends had parents who we knew of. He just seemed a normal kid that was in the sixth form. She was very sociable and had a huge friendship group. In fact, he became friends with some of the people in the sixth form because of her. He then became involved into that big wide social group.
I met him on a few occasions. He was pleasant enough, but was very different to her. Like, he just seemed quite quiet. But I trusted Ellie's judgment kind of on everything. So, if she likes him, that's all that matters, really.
Ellie and Thomas had been dating for several months, but with their exams fast approaching, Ellie wanted to slow things down to focus on her revision.
On the Monday when she went into school, she told him that she didn't want to see him after school that week because she wanted to revise. In my head, I remember thinking that was a good thing.
When we did house-to-house inquiries, we were able to find a neighbour who saw a male who he gave a description of, wearing a hoodie, dark hoodie with a hood up, carrying a rucksack, knock on the front door. And again, without any kind of signs of forced entry, we have to assume that he was allowed entry by Ellie.
The neighbour, he really wasn't sure 100% that it was the boyfriend, but it was a young person, very, very similar build. Now it's imperative that we find him so that we can speak with him and find out exactly where he's been and what he may have been up to.
In order to eliminate Thomas from the investigation, SIO Jim Taylor sends officers to check in with him.
I think it's fair to say that he gave the appearance that he was kind of surprised at why he was being spoken to by officers.
And then he came across as, in shock, like a rabbit in a headlights type situation. He looked pretty frightened.
He immediately said, "Is this about my girlfriend? I haven't seen her and I'm a bit worried about her."
Nothing had suggested at that moment in time that it was Ellie that we were talking about.
So it was an unusual thing to say, and it instantly raised suspicion.
Watching Thomas Griffiths, he scratched at the back of his hands, he continued to scratch at his face, and he continued to scratch at his neck.
He's presenting with what we would describe as defence wounds. When you attack someone, their instant reaction is to fight back and protect themselves. With injuries like that, it automatically, again, raises your suspicions.
The scratch marks, combined with Thomas's erratic behaviour, leads to his arrest.
Thomas Griffiths, when he was arrested, he presents as a young boy, if I'm honest.
At the custody centre, we can look to do all the swabs and the recovery from him on that forensic side.
Hand swabs will be taken, nail scrapings will be taken, head hair will be taken, blood and urine samples. The reason why the police take these samples is that there's potential trace forensic evidence on that offender, and it's really important for that to be recovered. We would also seize all their clothing.
He continued to scratch the whole time that booking in procedure was happening.
Once we're dealing with a homicide, it then kicks into place a huge mechanism of staffing, just going out looking for the evidence, unpicking the movements of Thomas Griffiths, unpicking the movements and communications of both him and Ellie, of course, really trying to understand what the motive might be in this case.
He had a phone on him that was seized straight away by the officers on arrest, and then that is moved on to the next specialist, which would be looking at downloading any data that might be within that phone.
Thomas is asked to account for his movements that day and how he got the scratches on his face and hands.
His story was that he'd been dropped to school by his mum, and that he'd felt unwell and that he'd gone back home. His story was that he was getting anxious during the day and that he'd started self-harming.
Digital specialists extract location data from Thomas's phone to verify his movements.
It is possible to track a phone's location in various different ways. One is using cell site data, where you can see the movements of a phone based on the cells and the masts that the phone has connected to in order to get a signal. At the same time, if the phone has location services activated, then it would even show us where we've been, when, what sort of route we took to get there.
With Thomas's story, we were able to look at that data and say, okay, he's left the home, he's gone in the car with his mum to school, that all works. So is there any CCTV that can show him leaving that school area? And we traced him going to the bus station and catching the number 33 bus back home. That showed us that what he'd said was right. And then what we do then is look at the phone data. So we'll look at the router that's within his home address.
Every device has a MAC number that would be specific to that particular device. When connecting to that Wi-Fi, it shows us a person is within the vicinity of that particular router. Could show us when they connected, if they disconnect and then they connect later on.
He's come home and picked back up on his router again. Again, that works. We can see that part of the story.
So far, police have been able to corroborate Thomas's story, and everything's adding up. It will be up to the forensic findings to rule him in or out of the investigation. 17-year-old student Ellie Gould has been murdered in her own home. She's been stabbed at least 13 times in the neck. Her killer has attempted to clean up the crime scene and make it look like a suicide. Officers are speaking with Ellie's boyfriend, Thomas Griffiths, in order to eliminate him as a suspect. The family liaison officers update Carol and her husband Matt.
They came back and said, "We've now arrested somebody, a young man." I think when they described him as a young man, the penny dropped. And I just looked at Matt and I said, "It's Griffiths, isn't it? It's Griffiths." I can remember just feeling absolutely thrown against the wall. That was somebody that we'd welcomed into our home, celebrated her 17th birthday with her only 3 weeks earlier. We just couldn't imagine that he was capable of that.
Nothing quite made sense. How could somebody that knew Ellie, knew what an amazing person she was, purposefully kill her?
And we were just in complete disbelief and shock, and I think I'd left it with Carol that she would call us once she knew more.
Carol recollects a conversation she had with Ellie about Thomas.
The night before on the Thursday evening, I spoke to her and she said that she was finding him suffocating, pestering her constantly about not seeing him after school, despite her saying, "I want to focus on my studies." And she said she was going to end it. And I said to her, "Well, what are you going to do?" And she just said, "Don't worry, Mum, I'm sorting it."
It's quite easy for a young person to think that their relationship is a lifelong relationship, that the relationship and its success is at the centre of their world. Many of us can identify with that first love mentality, and it's not uncommon for us to create feelings of obsession or fixation to some degree.
Friends came forward from the school, showed us Snapchat messages that Thomas Griffiths had sent to this group.
I think everyone's noticed that I've been really down lately, and I need to tell you why. Me and Ellie are going to go on a break and see how things go after exams. I've been so stressed lately and I don't know how to cope with it. I've been scratching myself around my neck area, and as this group has kind of become my best friends, I don't know who else to talk to. We know that it was Ellie that instigated the breakup. By presenting this to others as a mutual decision, he is reducing the suspicion or the reasons that people might attribute towards him for being implicated in the crime.
With a possible motive for the murder, Detective Sergeant Riddler assembles a team to search the Griffiths family home.
We need to do a house search to look for any bloodstained clothing or any clothing that might match the description of the clothing worn and seen by the witness.
When we carried out a search within the house, the officers located various bits of clothing that was damp still on the radiators, which Mum pointed out. Thomas had explained to her that he felt hot and sweaty and needed to change his clothing, so she just naturally put the washing machine on. There was also a pair of black Vans trainers. The SIO straight away turned around and said, "I want those fast-tracked."
It's really difficult to get rid of all DNA and all blood spatter from a pair of shoes, particularly if they're a dark pair of shoes, so it's not visible to the human eye without a good light source. There's lots of fabric areas, there's laces, there's indents on the soles of the shoe where little tiny specks of blood could easily get stuck. If there's any possible identified areas that look like it might be blood, there's a number of tests that you could do to confirm if it's blood or not. One of the tests that most police forces use is called a Castle-Mayer test. This is like a colour change test. If there is blood, the Castle-Mayer chemical will react positively and turn pink. If it tests positive for blood, then this area can then be swabbed.
Whilst they await the forensic test results, the interviewing officers continue to ask Thomas to account for his movements, which have so far been truthful.
He gave various accounts about not being able to get hold of Ellie during the day and that he was worried about her. We always take the stance that we assume nothing, we believe no one, and we check everything, and that was the basics of investigations.
Specialists continue to analyse Thomas's phone for its location data, as well as the router connections to his home broadband.
We then had this hour where he then drops off from the router, so we'll look at cell sighting, and that phone shows on the cell sighting, the aerials, the masts around Dairy Hill to Calne, that phone is travelling, and that phone travels across to Calne. We were able to say Thomas's phone was now in Calne area between that time when we believe Eleanor lost her life. And that roughly connects with the timings of our initial witness that sees someone go to the front door.
We have to assume that he was allowed entry by Ellie, who we knew at that stage was alone in the house. Both parents were at work. What we suspect is that in that hour that Thomas is there, that is the period of time that Ellie is murdered.
Detectives checked the digital timestamp of the message sent from Ellie's phone to cancel the plans for her friend to collect her.
And actually the timings are such that cause us great concern in the fact that whilst we could never prove it, we suspected at the time that that message was sent from Tom to a friend of Ellie's so as to delay being found out. Every single element to his story we were then trying to corroborate. He wasn't legally allowed to drive, so he hadn't passed his test, but we knew that his family owned a Ford Fiesta. And when we did CCTV trawl of the route between Calne and his home address in Derry Hill, we utilised footage from a bus dash cam that clearly showed Thomas leaving the scene and returning home.
As each bit of evidence unfolded, we would put that to him against what he'd already told us and say, well, that can't be right. The CCTV that we saw on the bus is showing us this, and each time he would disagree.
He denied any involvement, but wasn't able to say who else would have been driving his car at that time.
We can trace this car back to the home address. We then noted that Thomas's phone picks up again on the router, which connects with the statements that the neighbours have then told us about seeing him driving the car at the end of the road and him talking in the back garden to them about being anxious and self-harming himself.
Knowing that the scratches on his neck were from Ellie, from the event, rather than from self-harm, suggests that Tom is aware of the seriousness of the crime and of the consequences and is going to great lengths to prepare some excuses in case he's investigated for this.
Whilst a lot of the evidence was showing Thomas being in the area, and of course he was lying to us about his movement, but what I really needed was some forensic samples that would have placed him at the scene. In his account, when he returned home and saw neighbours, it was a short period of time, in fact it was 18 minutes, where his phone dropped off the family router and then reconnected.
That suggested to us that the phone had left that property.
We needed to understand where he'd been in that 18 minutes.
Let's have a look, see if he's gone out for a walk. Has he discarded clothing or anything from the scene and dumped it somewhere? We had a look at some maps and we said, come on, out there, have a walk, take it out there for 9 minutes and see if you can locate anything. As you come out of the house, you come across this big green recreational area and then a bit of woodland. One of the search team officers walked along for 9 minutes and then stopped. Pretty much came to the far end of the woods, turned round and could see a bin bag underneath a bush at the end of this wooden track. And then suddenly your chest is starting to pound to think, oh my God, what have we found here?
Within that bin bag, there was some bloodstained tea towels, some wipes as well.
The SIO straight away turned around and said, I want those fast-tracked. And those results came through pretty quickly to confirm that the items in there had Eleanor's blood on them. Someone had, as the scientist said, tried to clean up, but just weren't able to do it, so they've tried to cover their tracks.
It is another piece of compelling evidence. But the team needs something that links Thomas Griffiths directly to Ellie and the crime scene.
The Forensic Science Service had located blood spattering on the van's shoes, which were located at Thomas's house, and that blood was a match for Ellie Gould. Throughout the investigation, Thomas denied involvement and wouldn't admit his part in Ellie's death. But once you started looking at the evidence there was, forensics, telephony, CCTV collection, digital forensics, all these different areas, it was overwhelming.
Thomas Griffiths is charged with the murder of Ellie and is due to stand trial at Bristol Crown Court.
You can't ever prepare yourself for that first encounter. I can remember my legs absolutely shaking. I I remember looking at him and I just wanted to bang on the glass and call him evil and ask him, how could you have done that? Why did you do that? And I just stared at him the whole time. I wanted him to look at me. I wanted him to see me, but he wouldn't. He just had his head down the whole time. He was an absolute coward.
Despite having denied all involvement in the murder, Thomas Griffiths pleads guilty.
The only reason he pleaded guilty, I believe, was because he'd get a 6 off his sentence. He didn't plead guilty because he wanted to admit he had done it, because he kept lying and lying through the investigation. His only focus was himself.
He told us in the defence case statement that he had gone there to study with Ellie and discuss their relationship. They'd started to argue and he lost control at the point where he'd started to strangle her, and his memory is such that he can't remember what happened next.
Crime-related amnesia claims are not rare. This is where offenders claim to be completely unable to recall any information about the act itself. Many professionals doubt the authenticity of such claims because crime events are likely to be retained in memory, but especially and particularly emotional and intense experiences. By claiming that he can't remember anything about the incident, he isn't forced to discuss or disclose the details, and he doesn't have to take responsibility and accountability for what happened. It doesn't correlate with the clean-up, the attempt to make it look like a suicide, making excuses for the defence wounds, and the behaviour that we've seen from him by covering up his tracks after the crime. This further suggests that he's thinking about himself and how the outcome will be most favourable for him.
Carol has since reflected on scenarios that in hindsight may have been red flags about Griffiths' behaviour.
At the beginning of the relationship, he started talking about how much he wanted to spend on her for her birthday. That's almost like he's love bombing her, trying to buy her love. And she asked my advice, and I said to her, just tell him to buy you a box of chocolates. You've only been girlfriend and boyfriend for a matter of days. He also lied about his family having 2 holiday homes, and he even went to the extent of showing Ellie photographs of this villa in Mallorca.
These properties turned out to be non-existent. He'd made them up. And this is further evidence that he is comfortable telling lies in order to try to build that relationship with Ellie and win her favour.
People that knew Thomas Griffiths have since provided statements to Carol.
People have come forward and told us various things. We learnt that a previous girlfriend of his, he was very controlling over. He stalked her to such an extent where he was taking photographs of her and sending them to her, saying things like, I know where you are. We also learnt that from a very young age at primary school, he was a coercive bully. We also learnt from a rugby coach, he would have what he would describe as uncontrollable rages. That word uncontrollable rage is much more than just an adolescent being frustrated at losing. That is somebody who is losing control of a situation and doesn't like it.
There are multiple indications that Tom doesn't want Ellie to spend time with other people and that he wants to keep her to himself. Ellie tells her mum, Tom tried to stop me joining in a game in the common room today. He was pulling at my arm to try and make me sit with him. I told him to join in or leave me alone. The day before Tom murders Ellie, his behaviour towards her has become physical. In this case, it's clearly more than young infatuation. Tom clearly had an unhealthy, possessive, obsessive attitude towards their relationship.
I wish I'd known more about domestic homicides then, because I would have recognised these as warning signs, as red flags, and I would have probably talked through with her what she was doing on the Friday morning, because obviously the most dangerous time in a woman's life is when they end a relationship with a perpetrator like that.
I think it'd become over-imposing on Ellie, trying to tie Ellie down. She didn't want that. She'd said to him she'd wanted to call it, and he couldn't cope with it. And I think from that moment on, everything he did leading up to it, and then everything he did lead after it, in my opinion, was premeditated. He knew what he was going to do.
Thomas Griffiths has pled guilty to the murder of his ex-girlfriend, 17-year-old Ellie Gould. He claims he cannot remember killing her due to amnesia.
We heard all about the strangling, the stabbing, the frenzied attack, the fact that he washed the knife in the sink to get his DNA off it, put Ellie's hand on it, and he reinserted the knife into her neck to make it look like suicide. And go as far as when Ellie was dead, in my mind, to use her fingerprint to open her phone to send a message to her friend to stop her coming to pick her up is absolutely evil. And then to create a Snapchat group with a group of friends to talk about his self-harming, to again try and cover up his crime. Asking your mother even to put your bloodied clothes into the washing machine. And at the time we just said that was premeditated, surely. And his behaviour is of a very calculated, manipulative perpetrator.
At Bristol Crown Court, the judge considered the mitigating factors and stated that good character references, a show of remorse and the lack of premeditation were considered before sentencing. Thomas Griffiths is sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 12.5 years.
We couldn't believe what we were hearing. If that's justice, 12.5 years for such a horrific crime and taking somebody's life who's so young, there's something incredibly wrong.
But is that all her life's worth? Just 12.5 years? It's just an insult.
The scream of pain that came from Carol when she broke down as we walked out the court will live with me for the rest of my life. I'll never forget that.
Heartbroken by the punishment, Carol analyses the sentencing guidelines for when an offence is committed by someone under 18.
When Griffiths was sentenced, you treat a 10-year-old exactly the same as you do somebody a day off their 18th birthday, which seemed absolutely ludicrous with the current system. We were told after that he could have his sentence reviewed once he got to the halfway mark, and if he'd made exceptional progress in prison, that could be shortened. Obviously, we were absolutely outraged by that because his sentence was short enough as it was. The laws in this country are 400 years old. They are not fit for purpose.
Carol campaigned for a review of the law, and in 2021, Ellie's law was passed with the help of the former Justice Secretary, Sir Robert Buckland.
The case involving Ellie was another example of the rather blanket approach that's been taken over the years to sentencing for youth offenders. More needed to be done in this area to bring the law more up to date and to reflect far more the realities of the differences between a young teenager and somebody who is virtually an adult.
So far, we've achieved Ellie's Law, and Ellie's Law is the sliding scale in sentencing for youths. So the closer you get to 18, you're treated more like an adult. And somebody like Griffiths, at the age of 17, his sentence would be now 90% of the adult sentence.
Secondly, the opportunities for people who've been sentenced as a child to ask for a review of that sentence are also reduced or eliminated. That is very important if we're going to achieve certainty for the families of victims of murder and homicide, that they know to a high degree of certainty the earliest date that that perpetrator could possibly be released.
Carol continues to campaign for tougher sentencing for domestic murders and greater scrutiny of offenders when they are up for parole.
At the moment, it's a 15-year starting point if somebody is murdered in the home and the weapon is used from the home, and it's a 25-year starting point if a weapon is taken out onto the street. It makes no sense to have this 10-year difference, and we want the 10-year gap closed. Murder is murder at the end of the day, and it's so wrong that because it's a domestic murder, it's seen as a lesser crime. I don't think you can get a crime that's much more serious than a young girl revising and somebody coming in and strangling them and stabbing them multiple times in the neck. That's as serious as it gets, surely. It makes no sense that a violent murder in the home is seen as less serious than when you take a knife out into the street and stab somebody. The crimes are equal. Although In a way, a domestic homicide is more serious because there's the ultimate betrayal of trust.
This particular case was but the latest example of a number of issues that I believe had arisen with this area of sentencing that required reform. That's why when I was Secretary of State, asked a leading QC to lead a review into the domestic homicide sentencing. I'm very anxious that it report as soon as possible, bearing in mind the passage of time since I ordered it. Any recommendations would be put to Parliament because the law would have to be changed in order to reflect that.
Sentencing and justice is twofold. One, it's about punishment, and secondly, it's about protecting the public. And we're trying to raise awareness of how dangerous these perpetrators are. And the parole board to look very closely at when they do come up for parole, really consider, are they safe for release? And I don't understand with somebody like Thomas Griffiths how anybody could say that he is safe to be released back into the community. We've had a domestic homicide review published, and the reference to the bullying and the rugby coach are included in that. We weren't made aware of his stalking of his previous girlfriend until after that was published, but I am fighting to try and get that added so that probation and parole are fully aware of it when he is considered for release.
Following the conviction of Tom Griffiths, it left a huge mark on the investigation team who worked on it because of the unique nature of what we were dealing with.
This was particularly impactful, very hard-hitting. I still feel it's a hard one to talk about, and I know members of my team struggled through this one.
I won't ever have a birthday again where I don't feel guilty that I'm another year older and Ellie's not. I have to live with that for the rest of my life, as does everyone else that knew Ellie. Yeah, he could be out by the time he's 30. It's heartbreaking and it's so frustrating, and that's where changes need to be made in the law because it doesn't reflect that pain.
And we all feel it, and always will do till the day I die. We'll never not stop feeling it.
This has absolutely wrecked us as a family. You see a tragedy like this happening, you have to make that choice. You either give up or you keep going. And I feel that all of the work Carol's done is the thing that's kept her going.
It has ripped our hearts out. We feel hollow inside. Ellie's the first thing I think about every morning. And she's on my mind all through the day. And that's the reality of the sentence that we live with. But I have to use this grief and I have to use this anger to try and make a difference so that her death is not in vain.